now you're going to revise things.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. Tēnā koutou katoa. Really happy to be presenting tonight's speaker. It's lovely to have the Excellent Series as a celebration of our new professors, or some not so new professors. We're slowly getting our way through the list, which is really nice. It gives us an opportunity to do two things. One is to celebrate the achievements of our staff, but the second is it gives an opportunity to demonstrate critical content to society. And in many of the fora, we actually have some uncomfortable findings that we share with society, and it's really useful to point out the value of that evidentiary-based understanding of some of these challenges. Today, I'm really pleased to welcome Jacky. Jacky Bowring's research delves into how place, memory, and emotion shape our connections to landscapes. Her work through critique, design, and scholarship explores these themes quite deeply. Now, I've got a suite of books, which I'm sure that many of you are familiar with, but Professor Bowring's book on landscape architecture criticism in 2020 pioneers critique in landscape architecture, and her award-winning essay, Art Therapy, in 2021 offers perspective on memorials and public art. Her book, Melancholy and the Landscape, in 2016, and her advisory work on public memorials, including the Canterbury Earthquake National Memorial and the Pukeapu National Memorial Park, further reflect her dedication to honoring sites of memory. Her work has also been celebrated internationally, with her 2018 winning design for LA Plus Imagination, envisioning an island as a vessel for memory, and her 2022 climate-focused project, Ngā Motua Atonawa, Future Islands, which won the New Wow. Okay, New Wow. There's a competition. A fellow of the New Zealand Institute of Landscape Architects and recently named a companion of the Royal Society Te Aparingi. Professor Bowring is a distinguished leader in landscape architecture, and we're really quite proud of her accomplishments here at Lincoln University. So please join me in welcoming Jacky for her Excellent Series talk.
Yes, kia ora i te whānau. Thank you all for coming along today. So, yes, I'm going to talk about a particular focus on which is through the frame of landscapes of care. And when we think about memories, they're really interwoven in the landscapes around us. And this idea of how we care about those memories, what are sometimes called memoryscapes, or in the sense of places of traumatic events, traumascapes, as Maria Tumarkin calls them. And we think about, well, how do we care for those that we have lost? How do we care for those who remain? How do we care for the landscapes that are wounded in this event? And if we look to conventional forms of memory, things like obelisks, temples, or the arch of the Bridge of Remembrance, they're quite static. They're object focused. They don't do a lot in the landscape. And we can also think of very figurative based commemoration as well. The typical dead white male on a podium, which is a topic I won't get started on today because that will take me a long time. This example of the former Premier John Ballance during the occupation of Motua Gardens, Pakai Tori, in 1995, when he was beheaded and his head was replaced with a pumpkin. And I was going to speak more in a moment on colonial era statues as well. But what more can we do than these static, mute kinds of forms? If we think about this through the lens of landscapes of care, we can get, I think, to some different places. So the concept of landscapes of care was originally developed in recent decades in health geography, in a very formal sense of landscapes of care. So a medical sense of landscapes of care, hospitals, formal care, and so on. But along with others, I've been interested in moving this concept into caring for the landscape, in particular in terms of these intangible aspects connected with memorials. So for example, if we think about Queen Victoria, a classic colonial era monument, and I wrote about this in that award-winning critique for the Michelle Whitcliffe Art Writing Prize, in the context of how what was done to this memorial actually created a space for healthy dialogue. So rather than beheading her, knocking her down, throwing in the river, whatever, which kind of ends the conversation, Fane Robinson's Mana Ōtautahi, which you can see on the sides here, was added to the statue, essentially recontextualising it. So creating a kind of triangulation that speaks about a bicultural Aotearoa. It makes a space to speak about that. The two upright waka contain the 6 local signatories of Te Tiriti. So they're there creating this kind of tight triangle together. And I think that says something different about what memorials can do. So, as I say, I discussed that as one example in that critique. And the judge for that competition, the British critic Charles Derwin, said he came away from reading that thinking differently about memorials. And I'm hoping that some of that might happen today with this presentation as well. So critique, like those examples, connects with research and design in terms of how I work as an academic. So all of those things are important, and they're kind of an engine for one another. They drive a process of things happening. So for me, in terms of my work, there's research and scholarship in a sort of traditional sense. There's critique in terms of investigating these different sites, and there's this creative component, which is sometimes a bit problematic in a formal university environment. It's different to how research is sometimes counted, but it's also really significant in terms of bringing that research into finding form rather than just reporting on something. And an early experience of that was with the Pentagon Memorial competition. So I entered this with a couple of other landscape architects, another academic landscape architect who was interested in interrogating similar kinds of ideas. We were amazed to be one of 6 finalists out of over 1,100 international entries. I won't explain that because that's a little bit hard to see, but we did get the opportunity to develop our design further. But the main thing that came out of this experience for me was not about the design, it was about the process, and it was about the opportunity to get involved. But I will just briefly speak about design, just so that you know what's going on here. Our design was called 184 black box life recorders. So we based our design on the black box that's in a plane. It's known as the plane's memory. So our idea was that each of the victims on that day had their own memory drawn to a close, the same as when the plane crashed into the Pentagon. So we proposed one of these for each victim, these black boxes. And you can see they had an orange box that was placed inside them that contained mementos for that particular victim. That box is orange. And the reason for that is that black boxes are in fact orange. In our original design, we had 184 orange boxes sitting in front of the Pentagon, which would have been fantastic, but not really fitting with the somberness of the memorial. So that was the design. We didn't win. And we were actually quite glad not to win so that we didn't have to spend many years in a very formal setting with the Pentagon working it through. But what was important for me was that my team decided that I should be the one to go to Washington and meet with the families and meet with the authorities at the Pentagon. So this was a really amazing experience about empathizing, which is one of the keys to what I want to talk about today in terms of care, about understanding the people who were involved with us, and quite shocking encounter with them in that they had been together a lot. They developed a lot of black humour amongst themselves, so they were joking about things that you wouldn't dare joke about. But that opportunity to engage directly with this group of people was a really significant and powerful experience in terms of thinking about how we care for memory. And that experience became quite valuable with the opportunity to become involved in after our own disaster in Ōtautahi with the earthquakes. And one of the things that I became involved with thanks to Cecile, who's this evening, the Christchurch Central Recovery Plan. In particular, within that plan that addressed many aspects of infrastructure, culture, buildings and so on in the city, the idea of including a response to memory, which hadn't, as far as we could find, been included in other recovery plans. So through that, there was the opportunity to think about having an earthquake memorial for this significant event and to start to develop within the recovery plan, looking at some precedents around the world for the form of those memorials, the processes for how they came about, and to begin to set up this process for us here in Christchurch. So I then became involved in the competition, which involved writing a brief for an international design competition, finding a site, which was really interesting process that saw us look at quite a few sites in the central city, trying to find one that didn't have any particular memories associated with it. So it wasn't captured by one particular group or one set of memories. So we ended up with that site that wasn't really a site as such. It was just a place along the edge of the river, and the opportunity to have basically a free water feature in terms of the river. And I was also involved as a member of the design jury that selected the winning entry. So again, amazing opportunity to see this process of how we bring memories into our landscape, the landscape that we encounter in the everyday world of the city. And another aspect that I became involved with as part of this was in the design liaison group, who were involved in navigating some of the challenges of bringing that award-winning design to realisation. And one of the interesting challenges that we faced was, how do you put the names of 185 people on a memorial? It seems like quite a basic question to some degree, but it's also a question about care. How do you show care for those names, for each one of those individuals? The first response might be to do it alphabetically, because that's a kind of a natural inclination that we have when we have to list people, sort names, whatever. So Maya Lin, who was the designer of a very significant memorial in the history of memorial design, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, DC, faced a similar challenge in terms of recording the losses in the Vietnam War. And she said that she wouldn't put them alphabetically because that's dehumanizing. It's like a telephone book, that you end up with these lists of names, and particularly if they're very common names, it's quite hard to distinguish and find the actual individual. So what she did instead was she listed them in the order of the day they died. And this is a diagram of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial as it progresses through history. She said that in the order of the day that they were taken from us. And rather than being dehumanized like a telephone book, they become more like an epic poem. So they tell a story, and you can follow the shape of the war through looking at the memorial. What we ended up doing was following a different model of humanizing those names, because in our case, the same as at 9/11, the losses happened all at once. So it wasn't about telling a story over time. It was about thinking, how do we find a meaningful way to support these names on the memorial? So at 9/11, they developed a concept called meaningful adjacencies, which is to say that people who belonged together in life should be together in death. So again, rather than huge long lists alphabetically, they developed actually a computer program. It's quite a complex way of trying to work out who should be next to each other, because of course even a family might be split up if you list them alphabetically. So they were looking for workmates, people who lived together, who had been in different parts of the building on that day, the first responders, the people on planes and so on, and developed up as much as they could this meaningful way of bringing people together. So that's the kind of model that's followed at the Earthquake Memorial. And if you look at it and look at the names, you'll see straight away, of course, they're not alphabetical, but you'll see clusters of names. They're not labelled, but the groupings are there. It's one of those things that if you know, you know, so you recognise a group of names. People that weren't part of any particular groups are there randomly because that's how the earthquake took people. One of the big clusters of names is the language school that was in the CTV building. CTV and PGC were the two sites where most lives were lost. These were known as the sensitive sites within the city. They were not spectacular buildings to begin with. They weren't well-known buildings. They were just part of the daily backdrop of the city, but they became significant because of this. And this is another aspect of the post-quake memorial work that I became involved with. So these aren't formal memorials, but they are ways of thinking, again, how do we care for these sites? How do we protect them within the city so that they don't become developed and appropriately forgotten as the city continues to develop? So again, we had the opportunity to meet with people, meet with survivors, meet with family members of victims, in what were incredibly emotional workshops that were supported by the Red Cross to work through some of the challenges of sites and what might be done. And of course, for most people, they don't spend their lives thinking about memorials like some of us do, or how to care for the landscape. So part of this was actually developing sort of an exchange of ideas about what's possible. So this is the CTV site. It was typical of Christchurch sites after the earthquakes. Cleared. Everything's pretty much gone at that point. So through the workshops, through investigating international examples, a number of sort of protocols were developed about how to address these sensitive sites. So they included things like retaining ruins, such as they were. So as I mentioned, there was very little left. There's just the foundations, and rather interestingly, the car parks, which became quite significant because they were clearly labelled CTV. So they really said what the site was all about, a phrase that had become very familiar to people in terms of the names of these buildings. Another protocols was to do with spontaneous vegetation, which is to say the way that nature was healing those sites, that vegetation was starting to come back onto the sites, and this is part of a kind of therapeutic response. A paving ban, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment as well, but some way to define the edge of the site. So as I mentioned, these buildings were not well known. People didn't know where they were, so if they were going to try and find it because it was important for them, they didn't know where a site stopped or finished, started or finished, I should say. So this definition of the site became important, and that also came from some research done by geographer Kenneth Foote in the USA, who was looking at sites of tragedy, particularly where people had been murdered, and the different ways that sites could be treated, ranging from a sanctification where something very heroic had happened, through to obliteration where something dreadful had happened, and then in the middle, this idea of delineation to show where the site is and to contain it. Another element, hedges, or something like hedges, and this comes from the theory from Joan Nassau of messy ecosystems and orderly frames, which is to say when you have nature doing her thing, she can look quite untidy, and that can sometimes read as neglect, depending on what people are familiar with. So her theory was if you have a messy ecosystem, you have an orderly frame or a cue to care. It signals to people that the site is being cared for. So that would be part of it as well. And also survivor trees, which are around the edge of the site, and I'm going to come back to those in a moment as well. So a set of protocols, same thing for PGC, which is just a little bit north from there. Again, cleared, just the survivor trees in the car park remaining back. So thinking about how those same set of protocols could bring this framing of care onto the site and kind of resist the city invading it so that it could hold its space within the city. And one of the other things that happened alongside this was developing support for responses that people had made. And this is kind of like a proxy for empathizing. It's looking at behavioural traces and what people are expressing in terms of the way that they relate to the site. And these tribute fences, of course, are quite common at sites of tragedy, that it quickly happens that a lot of tributes and mementos and so on come to the site. And from a design perspective, this is one of the situations where you have to put aesthetics to one side, because what is most important here is that the people and their acts of remembering are supported on the site, not so much how it looks. So this is something quite interesting to negotiate. So this is at CTV, and we could call this tribute fence 1.0. And you'll see on this initial tribute fence a sign that was placed there. And that sign tells people that the site is being cared for. It told people that the permanent items were being archived by the museum, and that the organic material was being composted and put on the city's gardens. So people didn't need to worry that the things they left there were just going to be thrown away. That this, again, was all about care on the site. Eventually, that chain link perimeter fence was removed and a temporary landscape was set up on the CTV site. So here we have tribute fence 2.0, which, as I mentioned, is not a beautiful thing, but it's doing an important job. It is caring for the people who come to that site and want to leave tributes there, who want to spend time on the site and have that kind of memory of the tribute fence that had originally been there. Eventually that too went and a permanent design was developed on the site, to set up a space that's welcoming for people. And here is tribute fence 3.0, the final version, with a stone base, telling people what went on the site. The metal fence has become a pixelated image of kōwhai and cherry blossoms, and it provides that ongoing, again, a kind of a magnet for mementos to come to. And it supports that ongoing practice of visiting the site, leaving mementos, writing notes, lighting candles, all those kinds of things that happen. The image on the right is from a Japanese newspaper talking about the families going to visit the CTV site and how the site would support them in visiting their loved one who'd lost their life here. Another thing that comes up in terms of behavioural traces is this image, which is actually showing some of the mementos that were left in great numbers around the fence, and they had been moved onto the foundation of the building by people who were looking after the site. But what it raised was that challenge that some people really didn't want to stand on the site where this disaster had happened. It was very unnerving. It was something that they didn't want to engage with. For other people, it was really important to stand on the site because that's where this event had happened. So this raised the challenge of thinking about, again, as I mentioned before, having this clear threshold at the edge of the site so that people were informed about where they were in terms of engaging with that site. So something as simple as a paving band delineating the site, this is at PGC, gives people that reassurance about whether or not they want to stand there and connect with the site or stay in what for them is a safe space at its edge. And just going back to the survivor trees. So survivor trees had been something that I was researching at that time, looking at a range of international examples, including places like the Oklahoma Bombing Memorial, where a survivor tree made it through the collapse of the Alfred P. Murrah building. It was going to be taken apart by the forensic team because they had a lot of evidence in it, but people protested. They said this was really significant that this tree had survived. And they managed to get it kept. At Ground Zero, they found amongst the ruins a little charred remain of a calorie pear tree. They took it off site, propagated trees from it, brought one back to the site, and it remains there as a survivor tree. So survivor trees are important because they're kind of metaphorical in terms of humans. They have trunks and limbs, they have our kind of form, they have life cycles, they kind of symbolize the way that people can exist within a place, and in this case, to endure a disaster. So we managed to keep survivor trees at both PGC and CTV. And around the time of the earthquakes in Ōtautahi, of course, we had another major disaster in Te Waipunamu with the explosion of the Pike River coal mine. This is the cover of one of the volumes of the Royal Commission, which is a massive document that investigates what happened here. So this is most definitely a traumascape. There are 29 men still underground. It remains the site of a criminal investigation about what went wrong. The men were not all miners. Some of them were just contractors, tradies who happened to be underground on that day doing their job and were caught up in this explosion. So when we come to work on a memorial site like this, we can think of what is kind of a conventional method in landscape architecture. I want to say was a conventional method in landscape architecture, which is the survey, analysis, design approach. My colleagues are smiling at this, I'm sure. Known as the SAD method, SAD, which has the sort of sense of a linear, scientific kind of model for doing design. That you start with the survey of the site, you analyse it, and at the end, you have a design. Tom Turner, a landscape theorist, said the only place that people fit into this model is in terms of their functional requirements, and that's the presence of people in that process. By contrast, the design thinking model, which was developed in software and industrial design, begins with a process of empathizing. This is about user-centered design. So you empathize with those who are affected by the particular challenge, define a problem, ideate, generate ideas, prototype and test. So it has a linear sense in terms of a line of travel, but it's significantly here, it has these feedback loops that allow for continuing to define the problem, to go back and ideate again, to develop a new prototype. So I think that these two things come together. You do need to know the site, and you do need to know your users. You need to empathise with them. So at Pike River, where I was invited to take part as the landscape architect and memorials advisor, we did workshops at every step of this design thinking process. We explicitly used this process in terms of developing the response. We co-designed, which is to say we worked on a level playing field with our co-designers who were family members of the Pike River men. Ngāti Waiwai, Doc. We had architects, an interpretation designer, a facilitator, and me there as the landscape architect and memorials advisor. And I've included a quote there from the editors of Design is Democracy, and they're talking about co-designing, and they say, this collective genius, so this kind of group of people, is almost always wiser and more creative than what the designer can come up with alone. And that is definitely the case at Pike River. As well as those workshops that we did with the family members and the other co-designers, we were able to use again these kind of proxies for empathising, ways to put ourselves in the shoes of those affected by the disaster, which included films, songs, books that were made in response to the Pike River disaster. And one of the main elements to come out of this, and I haven't got time to talk about the entire memorial for the site, I'm just going to talk about one element, which is a memorial pavilion, is based on the importance of ongoing communication with the dead men. And this was quite significant. So one of the mothers in the film Woman of Pike River talks about banging on the coal slurry pipes with a rock. So Pike River was a mine that used a slurry system to get the coal out of the mine and down the valley to the coal processing plant. So she knew that by banging on these pipes, the sound would travel into the mine, and the dead men, would hear it. And she also talked about wanting to go and scream into the mine for this communication. And at the annual commemoration ceremony, the family members gather and they shout the names of their loved ones into the portal. So this communication, ongoing communication, was really significant. Another example, the mine's rescue team went in there in March 2011, which is about 4 months after the disaster. They wrote a note to the dead men. They said, "Colleagues and friends, we have commenced our journey to you. This has been the first step to bring you home to your loved ones. We will not rest and we will never give up. We will return. Kia kaha." So this sense of an ongoing process of communicating back and forth. There's also water that comes out of the mine. It travels over the dead men. It comes out into what's called a launder and moves down through the site. So there was a sense of a kind of reciprocation going on there as well. So we worked on how to capture that idea of communication that was so important in terms of the way people needed to deal with the site, to care for them, to care for those names, to care for those men and their families. So this is the portal. This is one of the most iconic elements of Pike River. If you've ever seen a picture of it on television, it's always the portal. And one of the most fascinating things about the portal and the mine is we usually imagine mines plunging down into the ground. This mine actually goes slowly uphill. It follows a coal seam through the mountains behind. So we had this idea that we could extrude the mine space into the open air, give the sense that people were part of that mine as part of that communication. So this is the portal. This is looking from above, and there goes the mine back through the drift, which is kind of like the driveway into the mine behind. And this is our proposal for the pavilion that kind of captures that space and provides that opportunity for communication. It sits there with a number of other bits of infrastructure that are part of that site. And this is the White Knight stream that runs along beside it, which is a tapu stream. So the pavilion echoes this form, which is what's called a mine set. So mine sets are usually used for shoring up the insides of mines. They kind of provide reinforcing the inside of the mine. At Pike River, it's not inside the mine, it's outside, protecting this ventilation fan. So we echoed that form, we basically tipped it up, and this is a semicircular form that resonates with that element. And the mine uses, the pavilion uses the principle of parallax, which is the way that things appear to move as you move past them, like when you're driving along the road and you look at something like an orchard or a vineyard, and it looks like it's all moving as you drive past it. So that when you're standing in the pavilion and you're looking at the portal, you can't see the landscape. You're basically blinkered at that point and you're in direct communication with the portal for this communication. It's kind of like a communication channel. When you stand at the portal and look back, it appears that the fins have opened up. So that's just depending on where you stand. They don't actually move. And then you can see this dripping, wet, lush West Coast rainforest, this incredibly tranquil, meditative, melancholy landscape that provides that opportunity for reflection and for quiet space. And you'll see on the roof there these crosses, which refer to something that the Pike River families did when they were locked out of the mine. The authorities would not let them come into the site. So they took the white road markings, the white lines that go down the centre of the road, they put a horizontal line on them and they turned them into crosses for their dead men. So this reflects that in the roof of the pavilion. Of course, not all memoryscapes are traumascapes, as a couple of the examples that I've looked at today. So I thought I would just mention this one because it is on the picture that was advertising this talk, so people might wonder what it was. This is a memorial garden that I designed for Holy Trinity Cathedral in Parnell in Auckland. It was a competition, and my entry was based on using archetypal elements of remembering. at burial sites in particular through history. Things like a labyrinth. The labyrinth is a very, again, metaphorical, symbolic kind of an element if you think about it at a site of burial. It's very different from a maze because a labyrinth only has one path through it, like life. You start, you walk, you finish. It had a number of other elements, but again, I won't have time to go through them all. The other significant one I'll show you here is the columbarium. So here is the columbarium built. This is St Mary's, which is part of the Holy Trinity complex in Parnell. This is my favourite photo. Unfortunately, it's a blurry photo, and it's the only one I have of it being blessed on site. And another element of it is this curved labyrinth. And in terms of landscapes of care, this is quite interesting because when people are quite agitated or anxious, walking a labyrinth has a very calming effect. So the counsellors who work at the site talked about how some of their clients who were feeling very tense and stressed walk the labyrinth, and it just brings that sense of stillness. And if you've ever had the opportunity to walk a labyrinth, it is quite an amazing experience, especially if you do it with two people. It's like an amazing Renaissance dance or something as you come together and part again. So a very simple form in terms of a landscape of care. But let's come even closer to home. Here at Te Whare Wānaka or Aoraki, here at Lincoln University, our own memory scape and what we have here. So we have elements of memory that we pass every day. We have memorial rocks, we have memorial gates, we have a memorial sundial. I say we pass them every day, but in fact, we don't pass some of them because they're not there anymore. So there's a lot of plaques that were gathered from memorial trees that were rescued when the trees were removed. There's plaques that were removed from Memorial Hall that are stored in a cupboard at the back of the library, I understand. We're, of course, here at this moment in Waimarie, which is on site of the Burns Wing and the Hilgendorf Wing. So the Burns Wing plaque is safely in the Heritage Collection. The Hilgendorf Wing plaque and foundation stone are in storage. So these are opportunities for Lincoln to have its own memory scape, its own landscape of care. And if we think about that term care and how we might address that on the site, we can think of also the connection to curation. It has the same root in Latin: care, cure, curare, curate, curated. So how do we care for our own landscape of care, our own memories on the site, not just those memories of those buildings, those people, but the deeper memories of this place as well? How can we celebrate them, commemorate them on our campus? Can we have a mara whakamomahara, a garden of memories? And I'm just going to leave that there and say, te mihi nui kia koutou. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jackie. That was fantastic. We have time for questions before we exit. So are there any questions that people have asked or comments that you'd like to make?
Have you been involved with the Erebus Memorial at all? Because from the news that one hasn't gone so well.
I have in various ways. Yes.
Is there anything we can learn from that one?
Yes, there is a lot, but it might be a conversation for a different time.
Excellent talk, Jacky. I'm interested in like the memorials you presented have all been about people. So I'm interested in the parallel with memorials about nature. So like at Aoraki, for instance, you can see plaques of where the glacier was and the loss. You know, is there an overlap in scholarship? Are they referred to as memorials as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think at places like Aoraki, where you see that change in the landscape and the sort of sense of what's called environmental melancholia as well. So the sadness about change in the landscape, that is it a kind of memorial and marker. And one of the things I'm quite interested in is eco-revelatory design, which is designing in a way that manifests that change to expose those narratives rather than people just not noticing. So I think there is quite an interesting parallel there in terms of the memorial. And there's a lot of interesting work on like lost species memorials as well, which also can be incredibly poignant and powerful.
Got it, Jacky. Thank you so much. Always an experience into your presentations, and you take us on boards, and we travel, we come back. It's always mesmerizing listening to you. Thank you. So, looking at your different projects and the memorials, and it's something we've spoken about in different times. The tactical aspect of, especially that it's the fence, yes, the 1.0 and so there were quite a few other examples in Christchurch that had a more of a tactical, or the memorial was moving along. So can you tell us a little bit about the impact of not having things just stuck in space and time, but also moving?
Yeah, I mean, it was quite an interesting time and to be able to see that all play out in the city, including those things to say that a lot of them were quite ephemeral. So there was a lot of things that people did. I remember one about people making hearts out of blankets and attaching them to fences and so on. But they were ephemeral, they're lost. And there's sort of like a poignancy about that as well, because we can't get it back. And it was also this kind of almost a weird nostalgia for that time, that people looked back to that time of those temporary memorials and the powerful emotions that were part of that. There were books written about things I remember, like the decoration of the portaloos and so on, which became quite a big cultural event because nobody had sewage, so you had to have neighbourhood portaloos, and it became quite competitive about how beautiful people could make these, and that's something that kind of again was lost over time, and that real sense of coming together, camaraderie, of being part of dealing with a disaster and so on, is something that was kind of, I suppose with some regrets for that as well. But again, it's about that process. It's like the stages of grief and so on that you work through. So some things remain as permanent, enduring forms, and others go into the wake. That's kind of use wake multiple ways there, probably. Yeah.
Jacky, has there been an engagement with augmented reality to capture some of those ephemeral elements and do that? Has that occurred in Christchurch?
There was a project early on to look at some of the buildings that had been lost in that way. So digital models were built, and not so much with augmented reality, not with virtual reality, I should say, but augmented reality that you could use your phone and hold it up and see where those buildings had been. So, and if you did it when you went at the building, you had kind of a ghost building on your phone, which is quite interesting, untethered and floating in space. So
that's the building, but what about
yes.
the memories? And
well, there is the big wall, which is in Tūranga, the library. So that was quite a big project of collecting people's stories and images, and again, those things that are so easily lost, and can go and navigate through that and have that sense of being immersed in a pool of memory as part of that. Yeah.
any other questions? If not, please join me in thanking Jacky for an absolutely fantastic, excellent series. Ends the year. Interesting space, especially with that last question. Thank you very much. And of course, Jacky, thank you.